Is this where you and Gilda lived most of the time when you were married?
In the dining room?
In fact, when Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner were married,
I came to bury Gilda just 3 miles from here in a non-sectarian cemetery. And that's when I decided I wanted to live here for the rest of my life.
Gene Wilder made us laugh, cry, and believe in magic. But behind the charm was a man quietly crushed by the chaos of co-stars he could no longer bear. From silent feuds to on-set meltdowns, these were the 5 people he worked with, and never wanted to again. Some broke his heart, others broke his spirit. This is the side of Hollywood Gene never wanted to talk about, until now. Richard Pryor. Gene Wilder never sugarcoated the truth. He once said, "Richard was a genius, but working with him, it broke pieces of me." Their chemistry on screen was electric, but off-screen, it was chaos. Wilder lived through emotional whiplash, production nightmares, and days filled with dread. Because Richard Pryor was as self-destructive as he was talented. Pryor's drug use was the first problem, and it was a big one. He showed up late, disappeared mid-shoot, and once halted filming entirely to lock himself in his trailer. Some days, Gene said, we didn't even get to roll the cameras. Cocaine binges and emotional outbursts left entire crews in limbo. Wilder later confessed, "I'd sit by the monitor and wonder if we'd ever finish this film. And sometimes, I didn't want to." Pryor's addictions weren't just personal. They derailed entire productions. Then came the mood swings. Pryor could be playful and loving one minute and cruel the next. He'd lash out at castmates, mock extras, and openly defy directors. He could look at you like you were his brother, and 5 seconds later, make you feel 2 inches tall, Gene once said. On the set of Stir Crazy, Pryor walked off halfway through a scene and vanished for hours. Nobody knew whether to wait, reshoot, or cancel. Gene's patience was tested daily, and his spirit worn thin. But it wasn't just about logistics. Gene felt unsafe, mentally and emotionally. "He never laid a hand on me," he said, "but I was afraid. Not of what he'd do, but of how far he'd fall." There were moments when Richard's anger felt dangerous. Chairs thrown, shouting matches, entire crews left shaken. One night, after a particularly rough shoot, Gene sat alone in his trailer and whispered, "I don't know if I can come back tomorrow." The laughter they created on film came at a personal cost, and for Wilder, it left invisible bruises. Even after all the tension, Gene never stopped admiring Pryor's brilliance. But admiration didn't erase the pain. "He left scars I didn't show," Gene said. Their partnership faded not because they stopped being funny together, but because Wilder couldn't survive the backstage storm. Years later, when asked if he'd ever work with Pryor again, Gene simply paused and replied, "Not if I wanted to keep my sanity." But chaos didn't always come from grown men battling demons. Sometimes, the storm came from someone much smaller, someone young, untrained, and way too cocky for their age. On one of Gene's most beloved sets, it wasn't a fellow star who drove him up the wall. It was a child. Paris Themin. In Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Gene Wilder gave the world one of cinema's most beloved performances. But behind that magical factory was a kid who, in Gene's words, nearly made me walk off the set. That kid was Paris Themin, Mike TV, a child actor with no filter, no patience, and according to Gene, no respect. From the beginning, Wilder didn't like the boy's attitude. He was smug, Gene said, and far too aware of the cameras. Themin didn't follow directions, often ignored the director, and had a habit of correcting others, especially adults. Wilder once whispered to the script supervisor, "If this kid tells me how to say a line one more time, I'm going to lose it." The tension was there from day one, and it only got worse as filming continued. Paris Themin treated the set like his playground, but not in a charming way. He disrupted rehearsals, interrupted takes, and played pranks that weren't funny. "The only magic I wanted was for that kid to disappear," Gene said years later. One day, while blocking a key scene, Paris started mocking the Oompa Loompas between takes. It wasn't innocent, it was cruel. Wilder called it disrespectful to the point of poison. The crew had to pull Gene aside to calm him down. What hurt most wasn't the annoyance. It was how Themin clashed with everything Gene wanted the movie to be. Willy Wonka was about wonder, imagination, and heart. But this kid, Gene felt, represented the opposite. He didn't care about the story, Wilder said. He just wanted to be seen. That attitude cut deep. Gene cherished storytelling, and seeing it reduced to ego by a child, it stung more than he expected. At times, he said, "It made me question whether the role was worth it." In the years that followed, Gene never attacked Paris publicly, but he never softened either. "That boy was not part of the magic," he wrote in his journal. Crew members later said the set always felt colder when Themin was on it, and when people asked Gene if he'd ever rewatch Willy Wonka, he'd laugh gently and say, "I skip certain scenes." But sometimes the pain didn't come from a bad co-star. It came from betrayal. Not personal betrayal, but artistic. Gene gave everything to make Willy Wonka warm, wise, and timeless. So imagine his heartbreak when he watched another actor take that character and twist it into something he no longer recognized. Johnny Depp. Gene Wilder never worked with Johnny Depp, but when the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory remake hit theaters in 2005, it wasn't just another reboot to him, it felt like a slap in the face. Wilder was devastated by Depp's interpretation of Willy Wonka, calling it soulless, creepy, and disrespectful. To Gene, it wasn't just a bad performance, it was a betrayal. Depp's version of Wonka was pale, twitchy, and robotic. The whimsy was gone. "It hurt my soul," Gene said. "There was no heart, just plastic." What bothered him most wasn't just how Depp played the role, but how far it strayed from the original spirit. Gene had crafted his Wonka to be mysterious but warm, strange but wise. Depp's version, he felt, was empty of humanity. "I couldn't finish it," he admitted. "I turned it off halfway." What added salt to the wound was the reason behind the remake. Gene believed it was made for money, not for love. "It was a cash grab," he said plainly. They weren't trying to honor the story. They were trying to sell toys. This wasn't just about ego. It was about protecting something sacred. Gene had poured his heart into the original. Seeing it turned into what he called an amusement park ride in a straitjacket felt like watching someone paint over a masterpiece. He also blamed director Tim Burton, but his strongest words were always saved for Depp. "He played it like a haunted doll," Gene said in a rare moment of public frustration. It wasn't personal, it was artistic fury. Wilder believed acting was about truth, not gimmicks. Watching Depp's Wonka flicker across the screen with dead eyes and an awkward laugh was, for him, unbearable. "That wasn't Willy Wonka," he said. "That was a stranger in purple skin." Wilder never revisited the remake, and he didn't need to. For him, the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory was a story about wonder, morality, and quiet magic. What came after, he believed, was just noise. "Let them have their version," he once said. but they'll never understand what it meant to make ours. Gene Wilder fought for the heart of every film he made. He believed in characters that meant something, scripts that had soul, and sets that felt like family. But as the years went on, those values clashed more and more with the world around him, especially with people who didn't see filmmaking the way he did. Mel Brooks. Gene Wilder and Mel Brooks made movie magic together. The producers, Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles, but behind the laughs and legacy was a complicated relationship built on creative genius and emotional strain. Gene admired Mel's brilliance, but working with him left bruises that didn't always fade. He could be a tyrant, Wilder once admitted, even when he was right. Mel Brooks wasn't just a director. He was a force. He ran sets like a battlefield general, shouting instructions, demanding last-minute rewrites, and overriding anyone who disagreed. Gene, who preferred a calm, methodical pace, often found himself overwhelmed. Mel would scream from across the room, he said, and I'd just try to breathe and get through the scene. The tension wasn't about talent, it was about control. One of their worst fights happened during Young Frankenstein. Gene had spent weeks perfecting a scene, blocking, timing, every line down to the syllable. Mel stormed in, ripped up the cue cards, and demanded a rewrite. I felt humiliated, Wilder recalled. Like I didn't matter. They clashed over everything: tone, staging, even wardrobe. Mel was bold and loud. Gene was sensitive and precise. That combination made great films, but difficult days. The love was real, but so was the damage. After one shoot, Gene went home and wept alone. I was proud of what we made, he said, but I didn't feel seen. He once told a friend, Mel's the only man who could make me feel like a genius and a failure in the same hour. Despite the creative highs, Gene always carried the emotional lows with him. In interviews, he called Mel brilliant and exhausting. And in private, he sometimes called him a beautiful bully. But while Gene's struggles with Mel came from creative friction, some co-stars brought nothing but chaos. Not because they were mean or malicious, but because they couldn't stay focused. One such case pushed Gene to his limit, turning what should have been a fun project into one of the most exhausting shoots of his life. Dom DeLuise. In 1975, Gene Wilder took the director's chair for The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes's smarter brother. He cast his friend Dom DeLuise, expecting laughs. What he got instead was mayhem. Dom was wild, unpredictable, and constantly improvising. And by the end, Gene regretted every scene they shared. He sucked the air out of the room, Wilder later said. Dom DeLuise wasn't trying to sabotage the film. He just couldn't stop performing. Every take became a circus. Instead of hitting his lines, he'd launch into off-script routines. I'd call action, and Dom would go into a 10-minute comedy bit, Gene explained. I didn't know whether to laugh or scream. The crew found it funny, at first, but by week 2 they were behind schedule, and Gene was losing patience fast. What made it worse was that DeLuise never toned it down. Even during emotional or quiet scenes, he'd throw in ridiculous faces or ad-libbed jokes. It wasn't acting, Gene said. It was noise. One day, in the middle of a serious moment, Dom broke character to make fart noises behind the set wall. Gene slammed his script and walked out. He told the assistant director, I can't direct a man who thinks every scene is a sketch show. Wilder finished the film, but the damage was done. He never worked with Dom again, and never tried to hide why. Some actors bring energy, he said. Dom brought confusion. In later interviews, Gene stayed diplomatic but firm. I needed control. He needed chaos. The film itself was forgotten by many, but to Gene, it remained a personal reminder. Never cast someone who can't listen. Dom's antics may have been annoying, but they came from a place of over-eagerness. With others, the problem was deeper: ego, power, and pride. And sometimes, it came from people Gene truly admired. Until the curtain came down. One actress delivered brilliance on screen, but behind it, the tension was almost too much to hide. Terry Garr. On Young Frankenstein, Gene Wilder shared electric chemistry with Terry Garr. Audiences loved them. But behind the scenes, their relationship was far from warm. Gene once said, "She was a star on camera and a storm off it." He didn't hate her, but by the end of filming he quietly decided, never again. Terry Garr came into the film with something to prove. She questioned scripts, suggested rewrites, and openly challenged Gene's directing decisions. "She didn't trust me," Gene said, "and I felt it every day." There were whispers on set about arguments, quiet, sharp exchanges between takes. While others laughed and bonded, Gene and Terry kept their distance. Garr also had a temper, not explosive, but cold and sharp. She would shut down entire conversations with a glare. There was no warmth, Gene admitted. She carried herself like she was above the work. During rehearsals, she'd interrupt scenes to say, "I don't think this works," often in front of the entire cast. Gene, who valued humility on set, saw it as a breach of trust. "You can't build magic with ego," he later wrote. Despite the off-screen friction, Gene kept things professional. They never shouted, never cursed, but the silence between them was louder than any fight. "We smiled for the camera," he said, "but we were miles apart." Once filming wrapped, they didn't speak again. In interviews, Gene was respectful, but never nostalgic. "She was good," he once said. "Just not good for me." Some wounds were loud, others were silent. Gene Wilder didn't always fight his co-stars. Sometimes he simply watched as a friendship faded, one scene at a time. And the next loss was one that cut especially deep. Because it wasn't just a clash of style, it was a bond that broke. Madeline Kahn. To the world, Madeline Kahn and Gene Wilder were magic. Their chemistry lit up films like Blazing Saddles and Young Frankenstein. Gene once called her the funniest woman on earth. But by the time they filmed Haunted Honeymoon, that admiration had faded into heartbreak. "She stopped laughing with me," Gene said softly, years later. What was once playful became painfully distant. At first, Gene couldn't figure out what had changed. Madeline used to be warm, silly, collaborative. But during Haunted Honeymoon, something was off. She arrived late, left early, and barely spoke between scenes. "She didn't look at me the same way," Gene said. He tried to reach out, inviting her to dinners, asking about lines, even cracking old jokes. But Madeline wasn't biting. "It felt like a door had been closed," he said. The deeper problem was her resistance to direction. Gene, who also directed the film, needed her to do retakes. She refused, politely but firmly. She'd do 2 takes, and that was it, he recalled. On one particularly rough day, she snapped, "It's good enough, Gene." That crushed him. He had always seen her as a teammate, someone who shared his perfectionism. But now, it felt like she was phoning it in. "She wasn't present anymore," he said. "Not with me." There was no screaming, no public feud, just a slow, quiet unraveling. Gene never badmouthed her, But he didn't pretend everything was fine either. "She was a cold shoulder in warm disguise," he wrote in his journal. When the film wrapped, they hugged, smiled, and went their separate ways. But Wilder admitted that something sacred had been lost. "She broke my heart," he said, "not with cruelty, but with absence." Losing a friend without a fight is its own kind of tragedy. But sometimes the shift is louder, messier. Sometimes the laughter fades because it gets hijacked. The next co-star started as a brother in comedy, but left Gene feeling like the punchline: Marty Feldman. When Gene met Marty Feldman on Young Frankenstein, it felt like finding a kindred spirit. Marty was odd, brilliant, and endlessly funny. Gene adored him. "He made me laugh like a child," he said. But as filming went on, the friendship cracked under the weight of too many jokes and too little respect for the script. Marty had a habit of turning everything into a bit. He'd mug for the camera, slip in winks, and break character mid-scene to chase a laugh. At first, Gene found it endearing, but soon it started stepping on the timing, on his lines. He turned every scene into a punchline, Gene said, and sometimes it wasn't his to deliver. Their rehearsal sessions, once fun, became frustrating. Marty would improvise wildly, ignoring cues and changing tone. Wilder was a perfectionist. He worked from rhythm, pause, tone. And Marty's unpredictability threw all that out the window. In one scene, Gene delivered a heartfelt line, only for Marty to cross his eyes and make a fart noise behind him. "It killed the scene," Gene said, "and it killed something between us." After that, they stopped joking in the dressing room. The friendship was cracking, one ruined take at a time. By the end of filming, things were civil, but cold. Gene stopped inviting Marty to script meetings, and Marty, in turn, kept his distance. "We didn't fight," Gene said. "We just stopped being us." Years later, when asked about Feldman, Wilder smiled thinly and said, "He was lightning in a bottle. And sometimes, lightning strikes too close." They never worked together again. Not every actor clashed with Gene because of ego or misbehavior. Sometimes it was simply oil and water, two brilliant performers with opposite rhythms. The next clash wasn't mean-spirited, but it was frustrating all the same. And Gene reached a breaking point halfway through a shoot, stopping a scene cold. Carol Kane. Carol Kane brought chaos wrapped in beauty. Her talent was undeniable, her spirit wild. But during The World's Greatest Lover, Gene Wilder found himself unable to connect. Their styles didn't match at all. "She wanted to float," Gene said, "and I needed structure." That gap grew wider with every scene. Kane thrived on improvisation. She'd change lines, invent reactions, and shift tone mid-take. For some directors, that was a gift. For Gene, it was a nightmare. "She made it up as she went," he said, "and I was trying to build something careful." One day, during a romantic scene, Kane burst into a high-pitched scream, completely unscripted. The crew laughed. Gene didn't. "We're not doing Saturday Night Live," he snapped. Their communication suffered quickly. Gene tried to explain what he needed. Pauses, beats, clarity. Kane nodded, but did her own thing anyway. After 3 ruined takes, Gene halted production. "I can't do this chaos anymore," he told the assistant director. He wasn't angry, just exhausted. He later wrote, "I wanted poetry. She wanted fireworks. Neither of us were wrong, but we were wrong together." After the film wrapped, They parted ways with mutual politeness, but no plans to reunite. Gene never spoke badly of Kane, but he never called her again either. She was brilliant, he said, but not in my world. That one line said it all. Two stars shining in opposite skies. Sometimes Gene's conflicts were creative. Other times, they were emotional. But the next one was something else entirely. It was about presence, about being in the room, and yet not truly there. The next man Gene worked with gave a chilling performance, both on-screen and off. Zero Mostel! Gene Wilder's big break came alongside Zero Mostel in The Producers. Audiences saw brilliance, a perfect odd couple. But behind the curtain, Gene was drowning in intimidation. I had to brace myself every day walking onto that set, he later said. Zero Mostel was loud, dominant, and explosive. And Gene, quiet, careful, and new to film, was completely overwhelmed. Zero's energy was a hurricane. He yelled, stomped, demanded attention. He constantly upstaged Gene, both in rehearsals and on camera. He'd shift his body just to block me, Gene recalled. He needed the spotlight to breathe. They argued over blocking and timing, with Zero once screaming, "You don't tell me when to speak, kid!" Gene felt like a guest on his own movie. Their personalities couldn't have been more different. Zero was a stage veteran, used to commanding rooms. Gene was a film newcomer, used to listening. "I was terrified," he said. Not just because Zero shouted, but because he knew how good Zero was. That made standing his ground feel impossible. Even when Gene nailed a scene, Zero would joke loudly between takes, undercutting the moment. "He made me feel small," Gene said, "even when I wasn't." Despite the tension, Gene never turned on Mostel. In later years, he even said, "He was a genius, but not an easy one." They didn't work together again, and they didn't stay in touch. But The Producers remained a bittersweet memory. Gene's breakout role, delivered under pressure. "It taught me everything," he once said, including how hard it is to stand next to a man who fills every inch of the room. If Zero Mostel's presence was overwhelming, the next co-star was the exact opposite. Not rude, not loud, but distant. Cold. A man who gave Gene what he wanted on screen, but nothing else. And sometimes, the silence between two actors speaks louder than a shouting match ever could. Peter Boyle. Peter Boyle gave a brilliant performance as the monster in Young Frankenstein. He grunted, roared, and danced with Wilder in one of the most iconic comedy scenes of all time. But off-camera, the connection was non-existent. "He was the monster on and off-screen," Gene said. "There was no warmth, no conversation, just silence." Boyle was professional to the bone. He hit his marks, nailed his cues, and gave everything in the scene. But the moment the director yelled, "Cut!" he shut down completely. Gene tried to bond, offered lunches, rehearsed lines together, even cracked jokes during makeup, but Peter barely responded. He'd nod, maybe smile, then he was gone, Gene said. It wasn't arrogance, it was detachment. Boyle wasn't rude, but he was cold. Gene said the set felt colder when Peter was around. He moved like he was doing a job, not making art. For someone like Gene, who craved connection and warmth, it was tough. During emotional scenes, Gene wanted to build a rhythm together. Boyle, instead, stayed locked in his own zone. There was no fight, no falling out, just a quiet discomfort. "We worked beside each other," Gene said, "but we weren't really together." That stuck with him. Years later, he still called Boyle a shadow, not an insult, but a feeling. And while their scenes sparkled on screen, Gene never forgot how lonely it felt between takes. "I needed something that wasn't there," he said. "And I never got it." Not every tension came from coldness. Sometimes the air on set was thick for other reasons: competition, pride, the need to be the funniest in the room. And when that dynamic clashed with Gene's softer comedic touch, it left no room to breathe. Harvey Korman. Harvey Korman was a giant in comedy, quick, loud, and commanding. When he worked with Gene Wilder on Blazing Saddles, sparks flew, but they weren't all good. Korman's approach was big and bombastic, and Gene's was quiet and precise. "I couldn't breathe in the room with him," Gene once said. "He didn't leave space for anyone else." From day one, Harvey challenged everything. He dismissed Gene's ideas, undercut his suggestions, and constantly tried to one-up him in rehearsals. "It was like being in a comedy competition I didn't sign up for," Gene recalled. While Gene focused on nuance and timing, Harvey aimed for volume and laughs. It clashed badly. One major point of tension came during a key rehearsal. Gene suggested a small adjustment to pacing. Harvey cut him off with a loud, sarcastic joke that made the crew laugh and made Gene shrink back. "He embarrassed me," Gene said, "and he knew it." The issue wasn't talent, it was kindness. Wilder believed comedy should feel safe. Korman, by contrast, treated it like a duel. They made it through the film. Their scenes worked. But Gene left the experience bruised. "He was funny," Gene said, "but it felt like he had to prove it every second." They never worked together again, not out of hate, but because Gene needed to protect his peace. "There's no room to build something beautiful," he said, "when someone else is building a wall." Gene Wilder never shouted, never scandalized, but he remembered. The smiles he gave the world were often earned through bruised feelings and behind-the-scenes tension. For every magical moment on screen, there were real-life fractures that never fully healed. He forgave, but he didn't forget. And in naming these 5 co-stars, he wasn't seeking revenge, just honesty. Because sometimes, even the kindest hearts have a quiet list of those they couldn't love.